In today's Black Clover video I talk about the dwarves and when they will finally appear and explain why that could be very soon. How they show up, when they show up, where they are and where they have been all these years. And most importantly, why we haven't seen any dwarves all this time so far. What's the reason, what happened to them and so on. I show you how their appearance might have something to do with the next Clifford devil Baal, the blacksmith devil. And last but not least, the importance of the dwarves in Black Clover. Also, only a small percentage of the people who watch our videos are actually subscribed, so if you end up liking this video, consider subscribing. Please enjoy this video, let's go! Besides the 4 elemental spirits and the Dryad, the dwarves are one of the 4 known intelligent thinking races in Black Clover. But just like elves and devils, dwarves are a pure myth for people nowadays. Before the elves and devils were introduced, they were also talked about as beings from stories until people actually met both races. The same is true for the dwarves, with the difference that unlike elves and devils, dwarves have not been seen for many years, which of course must have a reason. The first time we have heard of dwarves in Black Clover was when Charmy turned into a dwarf, since she turned out to be a dwarf hybrid, which suggests that one of her parents must be a dwarf and therefore the race of dwarves is not yet extinct. However, we know that there are no dwarves in human society, and so Mimosa has only heard of dwarves but does not seem to know anyone personally who has actually seen a dwarf. Dwarves seem to be only a fairy tale for the most people in Black Clover, and perhaps a legend for some older people who have access to more knowledge, such as libraries, family knowledge, or secret of the kingdom, when speaking of royals such as Mimosa. In any case, the legend of the dwarves is still present in the world, more or less. But here's the thing, Elfril, whose name is Lyra, lived 500 years ago before he was murdered by humans and later reincarnated. In this past life, it is obvious that he, as well as Licht's entire elf tribe, has encountered the dwarves before, which indicates that dwarves must have lived on the continent of the 4 kingdoms and most likely even still live, hidden somewhere. This can be confirmed as Lyra recognized Charmy's dwarf mana and then said that he sensed this mana a long time ago. And that is literally the biggest clue about the dwarves in Black Clover. Tabata wanted us to know that in addition to Licht's friendship with Lumiere Silvermillion and us trying to develop a closer relationship between humans and elves, Licht, as the leader of his own elven tribe, also established or at least tried to establish a relationship with the leader of the dwarf race, if we assume that the dwarves also live in tribes or kingdoms as described in mythology. You may be wondering how there can be an undiscovered kingdom of dwarves on the continent of the 4 kingdoms, when seemingly every kingdom is already known. And no, it most likely has nothing to do with the Diamond Kingdom. At least it wouldn't make much sense, although a diamond could theoretically make sense if you think of the earth element, as the element of the dwarves, and diamonds as a resource that can be found in mines, which fits perfectly with the dwarves. So who knows, but from what we know, they have literally disappeared from the surface of the earth, at least to the human eye. You will find out the answer to the question of where exactly they might be a little later in this video. So this suggests that something must have happened to the dwarves that prevented them from forming relationships between 2 different races, possibly related to the elf massacre, which occurred at what is most likely the last known time that dwarves were shown to have had contact with other races, 500 years ago. The elf massacre was a huge breach of trust between the elves and humans and all the other races that have tried to end the racial division in the world. This horrible moment of history was probably also the reason why the dwarves finally decided to give up any further relationship between 2 different races. Furthermore, Mimosa said that the dwarves lived in the distant past, as we have already found out for ourselves, and that they also possessed very unique abilities. What could she have meant by that? Magic alone is quite unique to us humans in the real world, but what possible abilities could the dwarves have that are exclusive to them and therefore can be called unique, even in the world of Black Clover? If you look at humans, elves and devils, none of them really have unique abilities. We know that devils have some sort of resistance to normal magic and that they have very good self-healing powers. They are extremely strong and generally seem to be born for fight. Humans, on the other hand, who are considered the naturally weakest race in terms of mana, have evolved to the point where they can also use healing magic or even create healing food, methods to defeat devils, and even magic that is naturally effective against creatures from the underworld. So humans use what little mana they have but combine it with finesse and complexity to be able to stand up to even devils. Elves on the other hand seem to be something between humans and devils in terms of their talent in magic and the capacity of their mana. They have a lot of mana, but it's not a unique ability because many devils seem to have even more, especially when you talk about supreme devils and even high-ranking devils, as we saw in this chart here when we compare Zagrid to the elven tribe. So elves are generally what we call blessed by mana, so something like a version of a human blessed with mana. Basically, you know. Sure, they have ultimate magic, but that is something that humans can learn as well, since they can bypass their own small mana capacity with the help of their ingenious use of runes and arrays to use even complex techniques, just like those of the elves. And I bet that even devils would be able to use ultimate magic if they only knew how. Also, elves seem to be the key between dimensions like the human world and the Shadow Palace. It has been even revealed that they have the 10 apostles as a counterpart to the 10 Cliffith devils. But this has nothing to do with abilities, to be honest. So in general, we don't have a race with a special unique ability. Some are simply more or less gifted at certain things. Of course, magic from the underworld is different from that from the living world. And we also have magic from higher power like Saint Stage or Spirit magic, but that is another topic. And so the dwarves will also most likely not be a race with a unique ability unless it is something minor, something related to the race itself, such as shape-shifting abilities as described in mythology. But humans can also learn transformation magic if of course they have the appropriate magic ability for it, such as transmutation or painting magic. So what Mimosa probably meant when she talked about unique abilities was most likely their crafting skills, but not just like a normal blacksmith, but rather their talent to make magical items, such as weapons that are equipped with magic abilities, or even the magic stones. These stones are another example of what dwarves may have created in the past, as well as possibly the demon swords that they then passed on to Licht. Why dwarves would have made magic weapons but then give them to another race is due to the reference to mythology, where dwarves are known to give powerful warriors powerful weapons to defend them from possible dangers. Actually, in mythology, almost every legendary weapon was made by dwarves. For example, Thor's hammer. Anyway, so from all this little information we got about the dwarves in these few panels, we can deduce the following. The dwarves were once beings who did not completely avoid contact with other races, but probably limited their contact only to the elves 500 years ago. The plan was probably to establish contact with humans by having Licht act as a bridge between Lumiere and the dwarf king or queen. What I want to say is that in many mythologies, the dwarves did not interact with humans because they were afraid or because they wanted to avoid general conflicts. It's better for them to be among themselves, separate from everyone else, so they don't make enemies. And the fact that they disappeared right after the elf massacre proves that they had contact only with the elves and realized that humans are not the friendliest beings to other races, especially those with powerful abilities. For example, to the elves who are blessed with mana, we have seen what humans have done just to steal the magic of the elves. And the dwarves have certainly heard about this incident as they have been in contact with the same elves. So logically, there's no reason for them to ever contact the humans again after seeing what the royals, that is, the direct representatives of the human race, did to the elves who dared to seek contact with the humans after many years of distancing between the races. One can only imagine what the dwarves thought the humans will do to them if they found out what ingenious craftsmen the dwarves are, capable of making powerful magic items. This roughly explains why they have disappeared since then. Basically, we have to consider two things when we think about dwarves in Black Clover. Firstly, the mythology, and secondly, the dwarves in Berserk, which is the main inspiration for Black Clover. But unfortunately, as little is known about the dwarves in Berserk as in Black Clover, simply because both series follow the same mythological concept that dwarves are extremely mysterious and hidden from normal life. And that is the biggest clue to understanding the dwarves in Black Clover. In Berserk, a part of forging powerful weapons and armor, which suggests that this also applies to Black Clover. Dwarves are also described as a race of small beings, which is pretty obvious as we can also clearly see with Charmy. Their members often stay in dark confined spaces. The darkness aspect is important because it directly relates to mythology, and since Berserk is the main inspiration for the world building in Black Clover, this will definitely be an aspect for the dwarves in Black Clover as well. The attribute of darkness as mentioned comes from mythology, where dwarves are described as dark elves. which is not to be confused with the actual dark elves in Black Clover. The darkness comes from the fact that they don't normally see the light of day, as they often live in hiding underground. You shouldn't confuse them with something like dark magic either. And so in mythology, dwarves are described as beings that do not appear and are never found unless you look for them, or rather if you know exactly where to find them. This could be an indication that dwarves will only appear in Black Clover if people, especially elves who could most likely know where they are, will specifically look for them. However, this does not necessarily have to be the case. Dwarves are very proud creatures, and when they feel threatened, they are not afraid to fight with all their strength. And indeed, there is a great threat in the world of Black Clover at the moment, something that didn't happen for many centuries: the Cliffith War. Depending on whether the dwarves believe that the devils might find them or not, they will either appear themselves to support the war if they believe that the devils are a threat, or they will stay where they have been hiding for the last 500 years if they believe that the devils will never find them. If humans have never found them, why will the dwarves believe devils could find them? Only people who can read keys, such as Asta, might be able to sense dwarves. But even that is probably very difficult. Apart from the fact that they hide, their environment is probably another reason why their mana and possibly even ki can't be sensed easily. Some of you may already be thinking of the Grand Magic Zone, where you could most likely have trouble detecting mana and ki. So it looks more like the only way to introduce dwarves to Black Clover is to seek them out and ask for help, which again would be very complicated and could possibly turn into a small fight, as the dwarves in Black Clover are most likely afraid of the humans and may even hate them, because they know what happened to the elves 500 years ago. A very interesting fight would be between the king of the dwarves and Asta. Imagine that the dryad or the elves tell Asta where to find the dwarves, or maybe even accompany him, and upon their arrival the strongest dwarf attacks Asta directly. But since Asta can sense ki, he reacts and draws his sword to block the dwarf's attack, similar to how Asta fought the Heart Kingdom Queen. Perhaps we will even meet the Earth Spirit in the process. The battle would get even more interesting if the Dwarf King recognized Asta's swords and asked him to return the swords to the dwarves, since they were the original creators and the human is not allowed to possess such weapons. This will then confirm our theory that the dwarves created Asta's swords, and of course it will then probably mean that Asta will receive a new legendary sword that is still in the possession of the dwarves and just waiting for the right person to receive it. We know that Charmy is a 20 years old human-dwarf hybrid, which means that there is at least one dwarf who had contact with a human 21 years ago. But if we consider the nature of dwarves, we can assume that dwarves have similar rules as the witch forest. That is, you cannot leave the place of the dwarves because otherwise you could reveal the hiding place to the public. Therefore, there are no dwarves outside their own lair, and Charmy is an extremely rare exception. Of course, there will be a backstory to how she came to live with the humans. Perhaps she was even banished precisely because she is a human-dwarf hybrid, of course as a baby. And we will most likely also have an explanation of what happened to her parents, how they came into contact, and so on. The dwarves in mythology inhabit either the inside of the mountains or in mines under the earth, which is why their attribute is the earth, and why the gnome, who is closely related to the dwarves in mythology, also represents the earth spirit. That is, the earth spirit is the gnome and is therefore most likely in a contract with the dwarves in Black Clover, just as the water spirit has decided to serve only the queens of the Heart Kingdom, with the exception of Noelle Silva. This perfectly explains why the Earth Spirit has not yet appeared, simply because the dwarves have not yet appeared in Black Clover either, and we can assume that one of the dwarves must have a contract with the Earth Spirit, probably the king or queen, as was the case in the Heart Kingdom. Dwarves are described as small, often very muscular, and generally as serious old men with long beards. And if we look at the only official picture of a dwarf in Black Clover, we can see that dwarves look exactly as described in mythology. Also, we see this dwarf in what seems to be a cave or mine, because we see some kind of mineral in his hand, probably gold, which indicates that they live underground. All this fits perfectly with the mythology and shows that in this case Tabata has completely derived the dwarves in Black Clover from mythology. The mountain dwarves are organized in kingdom or tribes, just like Licht's elf tribe, so we can safely assume that there could be a dwarf king or queen, the person who was in contact with Licht 500 years ago, before the elf massacre happened. Of course, now 500 years later there is certainly another king or queen, if dwarves have a similar life expectancy as humans. Furthermore, it is described that dwarves live mainly in underground halls filled with gold and jewels. This in turn fits with the image we saw in Black Clover. Dwarves were most famous in their skills in metalworking and forging magic swords and rings, but they were also credited with deep wisdom and secret knowledge, being able to foresee the future, take on other forms, and become invisible. Now all of these things haven't really been confirmed in Black Clover because we know literally nothing about the dwarves, but some of these traits are very important in mythology, and so we can assume that the dwarves in Black Clover are at least very powerful blacksmiths, as we have always assumed, which is where our theory that dwarves could have created Asta's demon swords comes from. We have also put forward a second theory as to who might have created the demon swords, namely the blacksmith devil Baal, the master of the first ever blacksmith. We will put the link to this theory in the comments, so be sure to check out the theory when you finish this video here. It is possible that the appearance of the dwarves is related to the appearance of the next cliffeth devil Baal, because both Baal and the dwarves have the attribute of the blacksmith, at least in demonology and mythology. Ultimately, it's entirely up to Tabata which aspects he wants to take into Black Clover, but more on that in a moment. Also, as mentioned earlier in this video, the shapeshifter attribute also kind of fits with the dwarves because we know that Charmy literally has the ability to change her body shape. Of course, this could be because she's a dwarf-human hybrid, but still, we can't ignore the fact that she has 3 different shapes, from very small to somewhat small to normal size. Maybe this means that Charmy could have more shape changes in the future. This would fit perfectly with the characteristics of the dwarves in mythology. Despite their small size, dwarves usually have superhuman strength, either naturally or through magic means, which in Black Clover would be their magic power, and Charmy has perfectly shown and proven that this is indeed the case. It is believed that elves are superior to humans when it comes to magic, but when Charmy used her dwarf mana, she completely destroyed Lyra. He literally didn't have a single chance to win the fight. This shows that dwarves are at least equal to elves in terms of mana. And if Charmy is not a princess of the dwarves and therefore might have more mana than normal dwarves, then her immense mana potential might even suggest that dwarves might have a little more mana than elves. But that too is just speculation. Now that we have a pretty good idea of who the dwarves are in Black Clover, let's talk about when, how, and where they appear or live or have lived all this time. From what we have just learned, it's clear that they all live in mountains or underground in mines, or possibly both. So they live in a mountainous region and have underground mines, but they probably live in large halls hidden somewhere in the mountains. Some people in the fandom believe that they must live in another continent since they have never appeared before, but that can't be the case because, as we have already explained, they met the elves 500 years ago. So our guess is that they live somewhere in the Grand Magic Zone between all 4 kingdoms, since normally no one lives there except people who don't want to be found, like the Seabed Temple or the Witch Forest, both of which are pretty well hidden and hard to enter. So a perfect place for a dwarf kingdom underground or in the mountains. As mentioned, even the Diamond Kingdom would make sense. And the last thing you need to know about the dwarves is how they will be introduced. As we have already explained, they will either sense the threat from the devils and come out of hiding by themselves, or if they feel safe from the devils, then the humans in the company of the elves will have to come to the dwarves. This will only happen if the humans want something from the dwarves. This of course would be to help in the war against the devils. It could have something to do with Asta's swords, but it could also be a request for assistance. Whatever it will be, the elves and the dryads should definitely know where they are. But when exactly will the dwarves show up? This is the most difficult question to answer. As for the need for support, it is already overdue, because the world is already in danger, so it could happen at any time. We believe that with the introduction of the blacksmith devil Baal, the dwarves could have a perfect time to appear, since Baal is a blacksmith, which is also the main characteristic of the dwarves. However, Baal doesn't necessarily have to appear in this arc if the war is somehow interrupted. It will fit very well if the war is interrupted and Lucifer and Adramelech have to withdraw for the time being for some reason, perhaps because of possible reinforcements from the Witch Queen or the Diamond Kingdom, or really any other possible reason Tabata could come up with for this arc to end. Then if the devils find another way to free the other supreme devils, possibly one at a time, the humans and elves would have a little time to prepare an alliance with anyone willing to fight the devils. And at this point, the elves or the dryads should mention the dwarves, since Baal is the next devil and the dwarves are most likely the next allies of the humans and elves. We can assume that both Baal and the dwarves might even be introduced around the same time, and consequently get a common arc or simply have a fight against each other, a fight with magic weapons. That just fits perfectly considering that both have the attribute of the blacksmith. But maybe Baal doesn't have anything to do with the attribute of a blacksmith at all, because after all, Tabata can do whatever he wants, and so maybe the dwarves will never play a really important role either, apart from flashbacks, past and world building. So what do you think about the dwarves and their importance in Black Clover? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and if you are new, subscribe to our channel with the notification bell activated for weekly Black Clover manga content, chapter reviews and theories. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye.